So within the United States, particularly in the larger cities, there has been a long history of problems of violence, particularly by gangs. And there have been many, many social policy efforts over the decades to try to deal with gangs. And in Boston, in the mid-1990s, there was a very concerted effort that ended up becoming the Boston Miracle. And in the 1990s, we saw the homicide rate in Boston drop 80%. We went from 152 homicides down to 31. Now, out of this Boston Miracle, so to speak, we learned three things. One was there was this research done at the Kennedy School here at Harvard that showed that it was a very small percentage of youth that were responsible for most all the violence. That we were really talking about 1 to 2% or a few thousand, 1 to 2,000 youth that in most cases were gang involved, and they were the source of the violence. So this had two important implications. One is that you needed policies and a focus that was directed at these youth. And two is to recognize that general policies, say more boys and girls clubs, more after-school programs and so on, were unlikely to have any effect on youth violence. The youth that were involved in the violence weren't the ones who were going to be involved in these programs. They were going to be out on the street, and you had better deal with them on the street. So the first thing that was learned was how important it was to have a focus on this. Second, what was unique about this effort is that the police department ended up creating a partnership with a set of inner-city black ministers. A very unusual group of people, 3 key people in it, all had gone to Harvard. All were exceptionally bright. All had decided to dedicate their lives to working in the inner city, and particularly working on the problems of youth violence in the inner city, the problems of street violence. What this did in Boston was legitimate police actions to deal with the gangs. This effort, which was known as Ceasefire, what it would do is the police department would identify a gang where, in street language, there was a lot of noise going on, i.e. meaning that they were involved in a lot of gun activity, shooting off guns and stuff. They would then meet with the ministers and invite these gang members to come meet with them. And they would offer them a choice. And the choice would basically be the following. And usually it was one of the ministers who delivered this choice. The choice was, we will help you get into school, we'll help you get a job, we'll help you deal with your cracked involved mother. But if you should not take that choice, we are going to do everything possible to see that you're put into a prison ministry, i.e. that you're thrown into jail. And in one particular case, there was a fellow named Freddie Cardozo who had been out of prison and on probation, and he was arrested. He clearly hadn't gotten the message. It was time to straighten up. And he was arrested with a bullet in his pocket. And because he was on federal probation, they were able to put him away for 20 years. And this created a whole story across Boston of the police really mean it. But at the same time, the fact that the ministers were really working with him is they mean it, but they're doing it in a fair and just way because the ministers are involved. Now, the third lesson that really came out of this was the recognition that gang violence could not be understood as just a police department problem. It had to be understood as a problem that the police department and the community shared. And so what's happened since in the last 20 years is the development of a lot of churches and community groups now who go out and work with youth. Really, prior to this, churches had thought of themselves as safe houses for, quote, decent people. They were going to be where you locked out the streets. Today in Boston, we have several dozen churches that are actively working out on, on these things. Now, how did that in part happen? Well, there's actually a very interesting story. It goes back to 1992 when there was a funeral for a gang member. And during the funeral, there was other gang members came in and tried to kill a gang member who was there for the funeral for his buddy. And the minister actually had to fall on this guy who was being stabbed to keep him from being killed. Guns shot off, 300-400 people stampeded out of the church. And so this was a strong message to the church community that if they didn't start dealing with what was on the streets, then the streets were going to be coming into the churches. So where does this put us today? What I think it's done today is taking what's a very difficult problem, a problem that often has strong racial overtones. In Boston, like in many cities, it's in the African American community that a lot of the violence is. And to a huge degree, deracialized it. So when you talk to people in the police department, they will tell you that as long as they have the backing of the ministers, they know they can aggressively deal with gangs. The way I like to put it is every gang member has an aunt who thinks he's perfect. If he's being arrested, it must be terribly unjust. Well, if you have a minister saying, no, in fact, your nephew Sam has been heavily involved in, drug activity, gun activity, and he needed to be arrested, both because he was a danger to himself and a danger to the community. He needed, i.e., a prison ministry. So Boston, through this effort, and it is an effort where, researchers, including myself at Harvard, have played an active role with the police department, have really created a new model for how to do policing, which is a model in which one is aggressive, effective, and yet one has the cooperation and support of the community at the same time, rather than a situation where there's lots of friction between the community and the police department. In terms of understanding, quote, the Boston miracle, i.e. this 80% drop, I think researchers have contributed several things. First, as I already mentioned, this whole identification that it's a small group of youth that are involved was done by researchers. That has really changed much of the policy debate. I mean, now the direction that places like the Boston Foundation are trying to push nonprofits who deal with youth is to get them out of creaming, taking the easy cases, and pushing them to develop the skills and abilities to deal with the hard cases. Second, researchers, my research in particular, has shown that we need to understand this is not just a matter of what the police do, but there's sort of a political problem here too. How do you take a difficult, potentially racial issue and find a way of dealing with it fairly? In Boston, the police commissioner sits at the behest of the mayor. The mayor can fire the police commissioner anytime he wants. Well, if you're arresting some kid and his mother, aunt, uncle are calling the mayor and complaining, you're creating a political problem. Well, if you have the ministers involved, suddenly they're backing up the police in what they've done and saying, no, this kid deserved to be arrested. He needed to be arrested. Third is pointing out what's happened here at a more general level so it can be learned by other cities. So I've spoke earlier about the notion of some people needing a prison ministry. It's kind of an unusual phrase. Usually we would just say, somebody needs to be locked up. Maybe they need to be locked up and the key thrown away. What the research has pointed to is that in important ways, when it comes to talking about youth, we still need to understand them as moral agents, that describing them as animals, as inhuman, is not helpful. It's part of what creates the conflict with the community. When a minister sits there and says, look, my question is, do you need a prison ministry? The last thing I want to do is, preside over your funeral. He's recognizing the humanity of this person. He's also demanding moral responsibility. So researchers have been important in sort of understanding what is it about the Boston story that's important. We've had over 500 cities come visit Boston to learn about the Boston Miracle. This is both cities in the United States, cities from other countries. What you find is that people who are in the police department, the ministers, are excellent at telling stories, but they have limited abilities to say why what happened in Boston might be useful in any other city. A sociological analysis really can add, right? It can show what's potentially general about what's going on in a very specific case. Otherwise, we just end up with nice stories about sort of, cops and ministers getting together and miracles happening, but for who knows what.